February 19th, 1943. Soviet tanks are 5 kilometers from an airfield in southern Ukraine. Sitting on that airfield is Adolf Hitler's personal aircraft. There is, by the German commander's own account, not a single defending unit standing between the Soviet spearhead and the German high command. A hastily assembled armored train and a handful of scrambled planes are all that buy enough time to get Hitler out. The Soviet tank crews driving toward that airfield have no idea who they nearly caught. 1 month earlier, the Soviets had just destroyed an entire German army at Stalingrad and were planning to end the war by summer. This is the story of how, in the space of about 3 weeks, one German field marshal turned that collapse into what many historians still call the greatest counterattack of the Second World War.
Later in this video, we're going to look at exactly how close that airfield moment came to changing history entirely, and why the Soviet commanders racing toward it had absolutely no idea what they were actually approaching. But to understand how Germany went from a shattered army to a war-reversing counterattack in under a month, we need to look at just how bad things actually were in early February 1943. By early February 1943, Germany's position in southern Russia was falling apart. The Sixth Army had just surrendered at Stalingrad. Roughly 90,000 men marched into Soviet captivity, with well over 100,000 more already dead. It was the largest, best-equipped field army Germany had fielded in the war, and it was simply gone. The Allied armies protecting its flanks had been shattered too, tearing open a gap in the German lines that stretched some 300 kilometers, with Soviet forces pouring straight through it. The broader numbers were just as brutal. Of roughly 3,300 tanks Germany had started the campaign with on the Eastern Front, fewer than 500 remained operational, and most of those were older, less capable models. German forces across the front were hundreds of thousands of men below full strength. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, tasked with holding what remained under the name Army Group South, was left defending a 700-kilometer front with barely 32 divisions, and Soviet High Command wasn't planning to give him time to sort it out. Soviet leadership looked at the situation and reached an understandable conclusion. The Germans were finished, and this was the moment to finish them for good. 2 massive offensives launched almost immediately, one driving toward the cities of Kharkov and Belgorod, the other pushing even further, aiming to reach the Dnieper River and potentially cut off every German unit east of it. If that second offensive succeeded, it wouldn't just cripple Army Group South, it could end the German position in southern Russia entirely. At first, it worked exactly as planned. Soviet forces tore through undermanned German defenses, took city after city, and by mid-February had advanced with startling speed toward the Dnieper crossings, directly toward the area where Manstein's own headquarters happened to be located. Here's the payoff from the teaser. On February 17th, Hitler flew to Manstein's headquarters to discuss the deteriorating situation and ended up staying 3 days. On February 19th, Soviet tanks appeared on the outskirts of the city, barely 5 kilometers from the very airfield where Hitler's aircraft was sitting. By Manstein's own account, there was no defending unit between that Soviet spearhead and the German high command in that moment. Only a scrambled, armored train and a handful of aircraft managed to hold the advance off long enough to get Hitler evacuated. The Soviet tank crews driving toward that airfield had absolutely no idea what they were approaching. They were simply following orders, pushing toward the Dnieper as part of a much larger offensive. It's a genuinely strange footnote in the war, one of history's most consequential near misses, and neither side involved in the actual moment realized how close it had come to mattering. What Soviet command also didn't know at that exact moment was that Germany's apparent retreat toward the west wasn't a retreat at all.
Elite SS panzer divisions had quietly been transferred in from France at close to full strength. Manstein was repositioning his armor rather than fleeing with it. He later described the move using a chess term, castling, shifting your pieces into a stronger position while setting up your most powerful attacker for a strike. The Soviets were reading a repositioning as a collapse, and they were about to pay for that misreading.
Manstein understood something Soviet high command didn't fully grasp. The further the Soviet forces advanced, the weaker they actually became. Months of continuous offensive operations had ground many units down to a fraction of their intended strength. Some divisions were operating at barely a quarter of their authorized manpower, with some artillery units reduced to a small handful of mortars for support. Requests for tens of thousands of replacement troops and hundreds of replacement tanks were met with only a small trickle of reinforcements. The lead Soviet armored spearhead, tasked with driving toward the Dnieper crossings, had started the operation with roughly the tank strength of a single German armored corps, yet was expected to cover more than double the distance Soviet armor had managed to sustain in previous successful offensives. By mid-February, that same spearhead was reporting fuel reserves at half capacity and effectively unable to maneuver. Soviet command kept pushing it forward anyway, driven by a wave of overconfidence following Stalingrad, rather than any real read on logistics or terrain, a mistake the Soviets had actually made once before, after an earlier victory near Moscow, and were now about to repeat at a much larger scale. Manstein launched his counteroffensive on February 20th, 1943, a plan he called the backhand blow. The logic was patient rather than aggressive. Let the Soviets keep punching deep into territory with no supply lines, wait for them to run out of fuel and momentum, then strike their exposed flanks with concentrated armor. The timing turned out to be devastating. German armored corps hit the overextended Soviet spearhead from multiple directions simultaneously. At almost the exact moment, several Soviet units were physically running out of fuel. The lead Soviet tank spearhead was surrounded and destroyed. Some crews were reduced to blowing up their own immobilized tanks and attempting to walk back to their own lines on foot. Within about a week, Manstein had shattered the entire southern Soviet offensive and was already pushing north. The same army that had been written off as finished 3 weeks earlier was now advancing. By early March, German armored forces had fought their way to within striking distance of the city of Kharkov itself, setting up what would become one of the more chaotic and hard-fought urban battles of Manstein's counteroffensive. Manstein's plan called for bypassing Kharkov entirely, encircling it from the north, and destroying its defenders in open ground, rather than fighting street by street. The SS commander on the ground disagreed, and ordered a direct assault into the city instead. The same commander who, notably, had already defied a direct order from Hitler himself a month earlier by pulling his forces out of Kharkov rather than holding it at all costs, as instructed. The fighting that followed was brutal, block-by-block urban combat against well-prepared Soviet defenders dug into buildings, with snipers positioned in upper floors and anti-tank guns covering the main roads into the city. When Manstein's superior ordered the attacking force to disengage and swing around to complete the original encirclement plan, the SS commander refused twice before finally complying on the third order. Despite the friction and the costly house-to-house fighting, German forces broke through the northern and western defenses over the following days, and by March 14th, the city had fallen for the third time in the war. In less than a month, Manstein had pushed Soviet forces in southern Russia almost entirely back to where they'd started before the winter offensive began, effectively destroying or crippling several full Soviet armies. Soviet losses for the operation are estimated at roughly 90,000, including tens of thousands killed and captured. The German forces that did much of the heaviest fighting suffered several thousand killed and wounded of their own, a real cost, but a fraction of what the Soviets had just lost.
For context, a Red Army command that had been actively planning the final destruction of an entire German army group was now, 3 weeks later, scrambling simply to rebuild what remained of its own forces in the region. Few reversals of fortune in the entire war happened this fast, or this completely. A few facts worth knowing. Manstein had already failed once trying to save the Sixth Army.
Weeks before this counterattack, he'd led an earlier relief operation that got to within about 48 kilometers of the surrounded German forces at Stalingrad, before running out of strength to break through, meaning the same commander who nearly reversed the entire southern front had, just weeks earlier, come agonizingly close to failing at a much smaller rescue. The city changed hands so many times that this was already its third battle of the war. Kharkov had been fought over, lost, and retaken multiple times by this point in the conflict, making this counterattack the third distinct battle for the same city in under 2 years. Soviet command was fighting a war on too many fronts to properly reinforce this one. Several major offensives were running simultaneously across the wider front at the exact moment this counterattack landed, all competing for the same shrinking pool of reserves, meaning the units that might have reinforced the collapsing spearhead simply didn't exist to send. The very weather that ended this battle also protected it from being reversed again. The spring thaw that halted both sides afterward wasn't a coincidence of timing. This seasonal mud, sometimes called the Rasputitsa, reliably stopped offensive operations across the Eastern Front every spring and autumn, effectively locking in whatever gains either side had made right before it hit. A few things made this counterattack succeed where most commanders in Manstein's position would have failed. He deliberately traded space for time, letting the Soviets advance into territory that weakened their own supply lines while shortening his. He concentrated his armor at a single decisive point rather than spreading it thin across the entire front, striking the most overextended Soviet forces with his strongest available units. German air power played a bigger role than often gets credit. Sortie rates roughly tripled in the weeks leading into the counterattack, giving German forces temporary air superiority at exactly the moment they needed it most. And perhaps most importantly, Soviet command had launched too many simultaneous offensives across too wide a front, competing for the same limited reserves, so that when Manstein's counterattack landed, there was genuinely nothing left in reserve to plug the gap. Manstein had executed a genuinely skilled operation, but he'd also been handed an opponent whose overconfidence did a significant part of the damage before a single German tank fired a shot. The front stabilized roughly where it had started before the Soviet winter offensive began, and the mud of the spring thaw brought both sides to a temporary halt. But the shape of that new front line created something that would define the rest of 1943. A massive bulge in Soviet lines centered on a city called Kursk. Manstein wanted to strike it immediately, before Soviet forces could dig in. Hitler delayed for months instead, and by the time Germany finally attacked that salient in July, the Soviets had spent that time building the most heavily fortified defensive network of the entire war. This counterattack bought Germany real time, and it genuinely reversed what looked like a certain collapse. But it also quietly set the stage for the battle that would follow it, and unlike Kharkov, that next battle would not go Germany's way. This was the last time a single commander's skill alone could shift the momentum of an entire front in Germany's favor. And in hindsight, it's one of the last moments anyone on the German side could look at the war and genuinely believe it might still turn around. If you want to see what happened next, the battle this very counterattack helped set in motion, let me know in the comments.